We was just talking on a separate issue to the G20 about these 17 South African men who are in the Donbas at the moment, apparently taken there on a false pretext. Criminal charges are now being laid against people like Duduzuma Sambudla, others in custody, about 5 other people or so. But what should government be doing at a diplomatic level, considering its friendly relationship with Russia?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very tricky one. It also idea of these recruitment allegations and whether there's a case of criminality that needs to be explored. But it also, I think there are a few things. Mercenary law, South Africa's regulation of, I think, foreign military assistance, it prohibits citizens from joining foreign armed conflicts without any, state approval. And it's clear that these gentlemen were there under false pretenses. They could also, unfortunately, face prosecution if indeed it was proven that they were mercenaries, which it seems doubtful from the distress call that was received. But I think the political fallout, of course, is that we can see that the MK party has distanced itself from the matter, insisting that it should unfold legally. And that Ms. Zuma Sambudla insists that she believed that the men were going for lawful treatment training, which I think a court of law would be able to see whether that stands up to much rigor. But I think more than that, of course, it also exposes the political fault lines in some of our own gaps in enforcement of mercenary laws and the vulnerability, Tembekile, of young people, young men, young women, in the context of unemployment, in the context of being made offers that are not always, that turn out to be absolute fiction or turn out to eventually place them in very dangerous situations.
And you have to wonder then how that can be improved, right, to prevent a repeat of an episode such as this, because as things stand, we're now basically caught in a he said, she said scenario where ultimately there are lives at risk.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that any exploitation of young people, of people who, believe that their circumstances, their material circumstances are so appalling in this country that they will take an opportunity, no matter how flimsy and in this case, no matter how dangerous, in fact, how potentially fatal that it may be, that they would end up in a situation like this. And I don't want to blame the young men involved at all. I think that they are caught up in something that's a lot bigger than them. And I certainly think that the industry of mercenarism is also something that we need to explore much more carefully. In Southern Africa, we've been relatively relieved and relatively free from that kind of thing. But certainly in West Africa, it's a whole industry of young men and a few young women who go from country to country, basically as guns for hire with no particular national allegiances. And we would be very naive if we thought that we were somehow above that, especially in a country where we've got such a high rate of youth unemployment.
And you bring us nicely, in fact, Dr. Pheko, to 7 o'clock, which is the time that we're given for the address by President Cyril Ramaphosa about the G20 summit, which concluded last Sunday in South Africa. Let me ask you then about the G20. I'm just looking at my monitor there. Perhaps we could show it to everyone so we all have the same view, so we get a sense of the president coming out, if it does happen on time. We're just seeing the sign language interpreter in a box. The chair is still empty. But Dr. Pheko Mbali and I have you. We were talking earlier about the tense relationship between Washington and Pretoria. And I wonder if ultimately the strained relationship might lead to a scenario where the other G20 members ultimately have to pick a side.
It's possible. It's possible. I think, as I said before, however, there is a precedent for strained relationships, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and so on, where countries have chosen, rather than trying to pick a side, to then use the diplomatic processes within the G20 to raise their concerns, to boycott, to raise, to walk out, to make very, very pronounced and very explicit statements of disapproval and disavowal, and that would be a much more productive use of the space. And I think one also wonders that if this becomes a precedent, particularly as we were discussing before, a structure which is already so fluid and so quite nebulous in terms of its, there are no veto powers and so on. There are no binding regulations. There are no binding obligations. It's basically a gentleman and gentleladies agreement, but which has, of course, received, increased in influence over the last 10 or 20 years, most certainly. And I think that what we think around is what is the end game for internationalism and for multilateralism? And I think that all the countries involved will be thinking about that, because there's something to be gained and lost by picking either side. And I wonder which country is going to be willing to pick a side with a country which is essentially a declining global power, which is the United States, with
Right.
an incredibly unpopular head of state as well.